Jason could still hear the echo of her words, soft and strangely rehearsed. "I just need some space. Time to think." Natalie had said it while wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself, like the chill in the room was coming from him. They were in the kitchen, her sanctuary, usually filled with music and wine and warmth. But that day it felt like a confessional, or a prelude. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded, heart tight in his chest. Married for 12 years, together for 15. They'd weathered miscarriages, layoffs, his mother's long cancer decline. She was his compass, his constant. So when she said she needed to be alone for a while, not forever, just a little while, he gave it to her. Because love, he believed, meant trust. Natalie insisted it wasn't about him. She wasn't mad. She wasn't leaving. She just felt overwhelmed. Her hands made small gestures in the air as she spoke, searching for the right words. Work had been stressful, she said. Life too loud. She needed to reset, recharge. Jason listened. Even offered to take some time off, maybe a trip somewhere quiet, just the two of them, but she shook her head gently. "I don't want to escape with someone right now. I need to sit with myself. Please understand that." And he did. Or at least he told himself he did. For the next few days he gave her space. She stayed at a friend's guest house across town. She said she needed solitude, time to journal, to think without the pressure of conversation or shared routines. Jason cooked for one, ran through podcasts he never had time for, and buried himself in work projects. He texted her occasionally, just a good morning or good night. Sometimes she replied, sometimes she didn't. It wasn't until day 4 that the first real thread unraveled. A buddy from college, Matt, messaged him out of the blue. "Hey man, hate to stir the pot, but is everything cool with you and Natalie?" Jason's stomach sank. "Why?" he texted back, fingers trembling slightly. Then the photo arrived. It was taken from the back row of a small local theater, grainy like all covert photos tend to be, but clear enough. Natalie sat 2 rows ahead, half turned toward a man Jason didn't recognize. She was smiling. Really smiling. Her head tilted slightly, her hand on the man's arm. Not a friendly touch. Not the way she used to rest her hand on Jason's wrist during Sunday brunch. This was different. Intimate, familiar. Jason stared at the image for a long time. He didn't reply to Matt. He didn't call Natalie. He just sat on the edge of their bed, the quiet of the room suddenly deafening. Space, she'd said. She needed space, and now, Jason realized, she hadn't wanted space from life. She wanted space from him. Jason didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the dark with the image of that photo burned into his mind like an afterimage. Natalie, her profile aglow in the silver-blue light of a movie screen, smiling at a man who wasn't her husband. Jason kept staring at the ceiling, his mind rehearsing a dozen possibilities, each worse than the last. He wanted to believe it meant nothing. Maybe the guy was just a friend, someone she ran into. Maybe she didn't think she needed to tell him. After all, she had said she was overwhelmed, not a widow. Maybe she was just trying to find comfort in company, to take her mind off whatever internal storm had been brewing. But Jason knew her. He knew the way she tilted her head when she was fully engaged in a conversation, the kind of smile that curled only when she felt safe, seen. He had seen that same smile from across dinner tables, in quiet bookstores, during vacations in small seaside towns. It wasn't casual. It was personal. The next morning, Jason didn't text her. He waited. No reply came. By afternoon, he finally gave in and sent her a neutral message. "Hope you're doing okay, just checking in." She responded 3 hours later with a short, "All good. Just taking a walk. Hope you're well too." Jason stared at the screen, feeling the hollowness between the words. There was no warmth, no trace of the woman he had once known. He wasn't the jealous type. He'd never been the man to scroll through her phone or ask who she was texting. But now, that very trust he had always prided himself on felt like the trapdoor beneath him had been opened. He started watching for signs, not because he wanted to catch her in something, but because part of him needed to know. Either way, ignorance wasn't peace anymore. It was poison. Natalie began going longer between replies. One night, she didn't respond at all. He told himself she might be sleeping, that maybe she had her phone off. But the little icon showing her last activity online on her shared calendar app told a different story. She had been on her phone until nearly midnight. Jason's mind kept circling the man from the photo. Who was he? He wasn't someone Jason recognized from her social circles, not a family friend, not a coworker he'd heard mentioned before, just some stranger, apparently close enough to sit next to in a dark theater while his wife was supposedly finding space. Jason called Matt back, hoping he hadn't imagined the whole thing. "That photo, was that from last night?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Yeah, man, I didn't want to stir anything, but it didn't sit right with me," Matt replied. She looked like she was on a date, not a mental break. Jason thanked him, hung up, and sat with the silence again. He pulled up Natalie's social media. Nothing had changed. No new posts, no suspicious likes or comments, but it all felt curated now, sterile, like she was cleaning her tracks in real time. So he started piecing together a quiet investigation. He remembered her mentioning a coworker named Evan once, just in passing. Nothing flagged at the time, but now, with context, it clung to him. Evan was newer at her company, someone in marketing. Jason didn't know his face, but when he did some searching through LinkedIn, he found a profile that gave him a face to place next to the photo. It matched. The same haircut, the same narrow jaw, same navy peacoat with buttons he remembered from the grainy shot. His chest tightened. Jason still hadn't told her what he'd seen. He wasn't sure why. Maybe part of him wanted to be wrong. Maybe he hoped she'd come clean on her own and prove him wrong. Show him that he'd misunderstood everything. But she did. In fact, she called that night, just before dinner. Her voice was soft, friendly, too friendly. She asked how his day had been, told him she was spending time journaling, reading. Jason listened, answered politely, let her speak. But as she talked about reconnecting with herself, all he could hear was the silence behind the lies. He hung up after a few minutes, and the moment the call ended, he felt it. That was the last time he'd give her the benefit of the doubt. Something had changed. Not just in her, but in him too. He didn't know exactly what he'd do yet, but he knew the next time he saw her, there'd be no pretending, no soft questions, no more space to give, just truth and the fallout it would bring. Jason didn't stage it. There was no dramatic setup, no carefully rehearsed speech in front of the mirror. He simply waited, quietly, deliberately, for the right moment. That moment came 5 days after he received the photo. Natalie texted him in the morning saying she'd be stopping by the house to pick up a few things. He told her he'd be home. That wasn't a lie. He'd cleared his schedule, made sure he'd be there when she arrived. But what she didn't know was that he had already printed the photo. Not the original text message version, no. He'd enhanced it online, zoomed and sharpened until there was no mistaking her expression, or the man beside her. Jason had placed the printout on the edge of the dining room table beside her favorite coffee mug. It sat there like a quiet sentinel, a truth she hadn't planned on confronting today. He didn't pace. He didn't fume. Instead, he waited in the kitchen, sipping coffee, calmly slicing an apple, steady hands betraying the storm that had long since passed inside him. When she walked through the door, the air shifted instantly. Natalie looked surprised to see him standing there, as if she hadn't expected he'd actually be home. She wore soft jeans and a loose white sweater, her hair pulled back the way she always wore it when she wanted to appear effortlessly composed. Her keys jingled as she set them down on the console table. Then her eyes scanned the room and found the photo. Jason didn't speak right away. He watched her walk toward it, watched her recognize what she was looking at. She froze. He saw it all unfold on her face. The recognition, the alarm, the instinct to mask it, and finally the silence. She picked up the photo with trembling fingers, her lips parting as if a defense might come spilling out. But no words followed. "That was from 3 nights ago," Jason said, his voice level, almost quiet. "The night you told me you were journaling." Natalie's mouth opened again, but only the faintest exhale came out. Her eyes darted to him, then back to the image, as if hoping she might still will it away, still reframe it somehow. Jason walked around the counter and leaned against the dining room chair. "You said you needed space. You said it wasn't about me. Just noise. Just pressure." She blinked rapidly, swallowing hard, her throat visibly tightening. "Jason, No." He held up a hand. "Don't say it wasn't what it looks like. Don't say he's just a friend. Don't tell me you were caught in a moment, or that it didn't mean anything. Don't insult me with a performance." Natalie looked down at the photo again. "I wasn't planning for this to happen. He's someone I talked to at work. I didn't expect anything." "You didn't expect to get caught," Jason replied. "But you were ready to lie. You were already lying. That night, that morning, this whole week. Hell, maybe longer." There was a long pause. She sat down slowly, placing the photo on the table with care, almost reverently, as if it were the fragile remains of something sacred. "I didn't know how to say what I was feeling," she murmured. "I felt disconnected, lost, and instead of reaching for your husband," Jason said, "you reached for someone new." She shook her head almost defensively. "It wasn't about replacing you, wasn't it?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Because that's what it looks like, Natalie. You asked for time alone and used it to explore something with someone else. You didn't need solitude. You needed a soft exit. A coward's way out." That struck her. He saw it in the way she flinched, not dramatically, just subtly. A blink too long, a shoulder that dropped slightly, like the weight of that truth had finally landed. "You've always been the steady one," she said quietly. "Always so composed. You work late, you don't complain, you hold everything together. Sometimes it felt like there wasn't room for me to fall apart." Jason's voice was softer now, but the edge hadn't dulled. "So your solution was to fall into someone else's arms?" Natalie wiped at her cheek, though she hadn't cried yet. "I didn't plan for this. I didn't want to hurt you." "But you did," he said. "And here we are." He stood, walked toward the hallway. "I packed a few things. I'll be gone by tonight." "Jason!" "Please," she called after him. "Don't make this permanent. We can work through this." He stopped in the doorway and turned to face her. "You wanted silence, Natalie. Now you've got it, and you'll find out just how loud it can be." Then he walked upstairs to grab his bag, his steps deliberate, composed. She didn't follow. And for the first time since she asked for space, Jason felt a sense of clarity. Not peace, not yet, but certainty. It was her turn to sit in the quiet now. Jason didn't slam the door when he left. He didn't give her the satisfaction of drama or the noise of a final word. Instead, he closed it behind him with quiet finality. An ending she could barely hear, but one she would feel in every echo of the empty house. He drove with no destination in mind, his bag beside him on the passenger seat, and the rest of his life crammed into thoughts that wouldn't sit still. The streets were familiar, but everything else felt foreign now. The city hadn't changed, but he had. And it wasn't rage pulsing through him. It was a cold kind of disappointment, the kind that doesn't burn but chills. It wasn't just what she did. It was how easily she'd done it, the months of normal conversations, of movie nights and shared dinners. Now felt like a lie she told while preparing her exit. He booked a room at a hotel near the river, not far from their home, but far enough that she wouldn't find him unless he wanted her to. The clerk at the front desk asked if he needed help with anything, and for a moment Jason almost said a time machine. Instead, he just shook his head and walked to his room. That first night alone was heavy. Not with sadness, he hadn't reached sadness yet, but with the weight of adjustment. The bed felt too big, the silence too full. He kept glancing at his phone, expecting something, an apology, a desperate confession, anything. But there was nothing. And in that nothing he found his footing. Over the next few days, Jason began informing people, not to weaponize her infidelity, but to stop pretending. Friends asked where Natalie was, and he stopped covering for her. When a colleague invited them both to dinner, Jason responded with a simple, "Natalie and I have separated. She's seeing someone else." He didn't offer details, but he didn't hide from them either. The reactions varied, shock, concern, awkward silence, but he handled each one with calm clarity. No bitterness, just facts. Word spread quickly, as it always does in shared social circles. People began distancing themselves from Natalie, not out of malice, but from discomfort. The betrayal wasn't just between her and Jason, it rippled through friendships and family ties. People had invested in their relationship, some had envied it. Now it sat cracked and exposed, and Natalie became a cautionary tale of what happens when you confuse clarity with cowardice. Jason's in-laws, once warm and welcoming, called him to apologize. Her sister Emily cried when he told her the truth. "I can't believe she did that to you," she whispered. "You gave her everything." Jason didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. Meanwhile, Natalie had expected space to feel freeing, but instead it began closing in on her like a shrinking room. Without Jason, the house was still, unnerving in its emptiness. The soft background noise of his life, his laughter, the late-night clinking of mugs, the way he hummed while fixing things, was gone. And in its place was the very silence she'd asked for. At first she told herself it was necessary, she told friends she just needed a clean break, time to rediscover herself. But slowly she realized that what she'd mistaken for rediscovery was in fact a loss she hadn't calculated. Evan, the man she had wrapped her uncertainty around like a security blanket, began to fade. He wasn't built for fallout. He wasn't designed for consequences. He liked the fantasy, not the real-life mess of a woman unraveling a marriage and all the baggage that came with it. When mutual friends stopped inviting them to events and coworkers began treating her like something contagious, Evan quietly stepped back. First came fewer texts, then canceled plans, then nothing. Natalie tried to salvage her narrative, but without Jason to balance her life, it began tipping sideways. People didn't understand her need for space. They didn't rally behind her. There were no congratulations or heartfelt affirmations, just polite nods and averted gazes. The silence she had longed for became isolation. Jason, on the other hand, began rebuilding, not quickly, not with false positivity, but intentionally. He started jogging again. He called old friends he hadn't seen in years. He began seeing a therapist, not because he was broken, but because he refused to carry unprocessed pain into whatever came next. Healing wasn't instant, but it was happening. One afternoon he ran into Natalie at the grocery store. She looked thinner, somehow smaller, her usual polished demeanor now fraying at the edges. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look good," she said, voice uncertain. Jason nodded politely. "I feel good," he replied, then turned away without asking how she was. She stood there for a moment longer, looking at him like a stranger. Because he was. The man who had once given her everything, who had offered space instead of resistance, had finally given her what she asked for. And now she was alone in it. Jason didn't rush to reinvent his life. He let the silence Natalie left behind settle naturally, like dust after a storm. There was no rebound, no immediate search for new love or revenge. He wasn't interested in proving anything. What he wanted, what he needed, was stability, clarity, and a return to himself. At first, he still caught himself reaching for 2 coffee mugs in the morning or expecting her voice to call out from another room. Habits are hard to kill, especially the quiet ones. But each time he adjusted. He learned to sit with the absence rather than fight it. He replaced the second mug with a book, a podcast, a slow, unhurried walk to nowhere in particular. In therapy, he spoke openly, not just about Natalie's betrayal, but about the pieces of himself he'd left behind in the marriage. Over time, he recognized how much of his identity had been wrapped around being the dependable one, the steady rock. He had made space for her again and again, but somewhere along the way he'd stopped checking if she still deserved it. That realization didn't make him bitter, it made him wiser. Meanwhile, Natalie's life had quieted in a different way. She returned to work, but it was never the same. Whispers followed her into meeting rooms. Colleagues who once admired her now kept a safe distance. Evan had vanished entirely within weeks of Jason leaving, slipping out of her life with the same low-impact demeanor he had entered it with. There was no goodbye, no closure, just an unanswered message thread and a social media account that suddenly went private. Natalie found herself scrolling through old photos more than she cared to admit. Pictures of holidays with Jason, dinners at home, that weekend getaway to the cabin in Vermont. At the time, she had told herself she felt suffocated. But now, looking back, she realized how many of those moments were filled with quiet, unspoken joy, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's gone. Her friends, the few who remained, offered platitudes. You were brave to follow your heart. Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. But Natalie knew they were filling space with words, trying to avoid the truth. She had left something good, something rare, for a feeling that hadn't lasted. Jason didn't gloat. He didn't post cryptic quotes on social media or share vague updates meant to sting. He simply moved forward. He changed his number, not out of spite, but because he no longer wanted his past to have a direct line into his present. He redecorated the house, nothing drastic, but enough to make it feel like his. The walls were lighter, the furniture rearranged. It was still home, but now it reflected only him. Months later, Jason received a handwritten letter from Natalie. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't beg. She apologized, not just for what she had done, but for how she'd diminished him to justify her actions. She admitted she had mistaken his calm for complacency, his steadiness for stagnation. The letter ended with a single sentence. I hope you found the peace I went searching for. Jason folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer, and left it there. He didn't need to answer it. He already had his peace, and this time he hadn't needed to ask anyone for permission to keep it.